I'm going to spend about 25 minutes to run through our findings on this report on making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. The presentation will cover the 3 chapters of the report. The first is on Africa's macroeconomic outlook in the short and medium terms. The second is on boosting effective domestic capital mobilization and efficient use. And the third is on the role of institutions and the rule of law for making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. Then I will run through what is a toolbox of key actions that countries can take in order to make that happen for Africa. Straight into chapter 1, we can see that Africa's Please, can you put back the PowerPoint again? Thank you. We can see that Africa's growth has continued to remain resilient, even in the midst of all the challenges, the headwinds that global economies and African economies have faced in recent years, the most recent of it being the significant trade policy uncertainties that has emerged since the Liberation Day announcements of the United States. Because of that, we have revised down the growth performance, expected growth performance of countries in Africa. On average, our GDP growth is expected to now be 3.9% in the year 2025 and 4.0% in 2026, reflecting a 0.2 and 0.4 percentage point reductions, downgrades from what was estimated in our macroeconomic outlook reports in January because of the challenges that we're seeing, the uncertainties created by the trade tariffs that we've been talking about. And because of that, you also see that 21 African countries, even after taking into account the turbulence in the global economy, these 21 African countries will exceed about 5% of growth, GDP growth in 2024 and in 2025. And we see also that 5 African countries will grow by more than 7 percentage points in their GDP. And this is the point that we have already estimated will be required to break the vicious cycles of poverty on the continent. And 13 out of 20 African economies will remain among the 20, so 13 countries in Africa will be among the 20 fastest growing economies in the world. So from here, you can see that macroeconomic stabilization and policies that has been implemented by many African countries has continued to yield results. And for that, we really need to congratulate our African governments and institutions that support the continent, because we are seeing real impacts in the development of the continent. And one key measure we're always keen about is GDP per capita, because it's a very good way to track how poverty is going. On the left side of this slide, you will see that GDP per capita in Africa has continued to increase gradually from 0.7% in 2023, and also the negative 3.14% due to COVID in 2020. We've now risen to expect of 0.9% this year in 2024, but expecting to get to 0.5, 1.5 and 1.7% growth in GDP per capita growth in 2025 and 2026 respectively. And on the right side of the slide, you will see the performance with regards to actual impacts on people, reducing the poverty head count on the continent. Since 2014, we've seen the poverty head count on the continent go down significantly from 32.2% of the population to 31.2% of the population when we had the COVID-19 pandemic hit the world. And because of COVID-19, as you recall, in 2020, we did report that over 30 million Africans were put back into poverty as COVID reversed over 1 decade of progress made in socioeconomic transformation on the continent. But even after that reversal, we have seen a very rapid return in terms of reductions, in terms of the poverty head count on the continent, now at about 30.6%. This tells that macroeconomic policies that's going on in the continent is actually yielding results, even as our population continues to grow. Now, in the next slide, you are going to see that this performance that we are talking about is varied across countries and across different regional groupings in Africa, by geographic regions, but also by country groupings in terms of the structure of their economies, with Eastern Africa once again taking the lead amongst its peers because of significant diversification of their economies. The economy in the Eastern Africa region is estimated to grow by almost 6% by 2026, which is heading towards that 7 percentage point to have meaningful impacts on poverty reduction and job creation for youths in Africa. And all the other regions of the continent are also doing well, albeit gradually. East Africa is followed by West Africa. Then we have North Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa. And even Southern Africa, that we have recurrently reported as having challenges because of structural issues in South Africa, is now beginning to grow, despite the challenges we have seen with regard to the trade uncertainties and the trade tariffs. If you look at the economic groupings across the continent, then you find that non-resource intensive countries continue to maintain more than 5 percentage point growth since COVID-19. And you might remember that even during COVID, this was the economies in Africa that did not actually see significant recession. So again, something going on with how we relate with natural resources, which is one of the part of the themes of this event, of these meetings, on making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. But the significant challenges in our macroeconomic fundamentals continue to remain, but even there, we see a mixed picture. Several countries have recorded significant progress, and on average, inflation, which reached 18.7% in 2024, is now heading downwards. So we predict 13.7%, 13.8% in 2025, and going down to below the double digits in terms of getting inflation down to 0.9% in 2026. And when you look at exchange rate dynamics, you find exactly the same issues, where we see that despite the challenges of exchange rate hiking and currency depreciation in 2024, in 2025 and 2026, we expect 21 African countries to see depreciation continuing, albeit more gradually, but appreciation in economies, in currencies for about 25 African countries as well. So again, even in the macroeconomic dynamics in Africa, we are seeing some significant changes. But again, debt and the debt dynamics in Africa continue to remain a policy concern. But when you look deep, it is not because Africa is borrowing more. It is because of the structure of the African debt. It's also because of transparency and accountability, and also the capacity of countries to be able to manage debt for growth in terms of focusing on debt productivity, not debt for refinancing debt, which is now happening a lot on the continent. But one point I want to raise is the issue around the cost of capital on the continent. This is a subject we have always raised in our AEO reports. And when you look in the structure of Africa's debt, you see that one of the drivers is the changing the structure of the debt more to commercial creditors. We now see that debt refinancing in Africa, which will this year cost Africa about $89 billion just to refinance, debt to service existing debt. 53% of that is for private creditors, because private loans are always shorter terms, higher interest rates, often more opaque than if you are borrowing from the Paris Club Group and also MDBs. And our estimates actually do show that African countries are paying 500%, and I hope it sinks, 500% more in interest rates when they are borrowing from private creditors, from commercial creditors, than when they are borrowing from multilateral development banks, such as the African Development Bank or the World Bank, and so on. And this already tells us that for us to make debt work for growth in Africa, there needs to be a stronger African Development Bank, a stronger African Development Fund, a stronger African Development financial institutions that will help to mobilize concessional resources, low-cost resources, but longer-term loans that can be used for doing longer-term development planning and implementation over the long run. And this next point we have there is that external service for debt is crowding out fiscal resources from the usual governance of countries to deliver on education, to deliver on health, and deliver on all those. That black line there is the rapid rise in the cost of debt, which is because of the changing structure of debt, but also the risk perceptions that we have always talked about in Africa's debt composition. Now, when you look at this slide, we have seen this before in 2024. On the left side there, we see what we call the paradox in Africa's cost of debt, because Africa has been demonstrably seen as the least defaulting in long-term infrastructure financed projects over a long time of period that Moody's Analytics have tried to look into, at 1.9% default rate compared to 12.4% in East Asia. And even in developed countries, we have 6.6% in North America and 4.6% in Asia. But Africa still pays higher premiums for accessing capital. And again, this is not unique to Africa, because when you dig deeper, you'll find out what is driving it is poverty. And on the right side of that slide, you see a perfect correlation between sovereign ratings by Moody's Analytics and GDP per capita growth, which means that the less your GDP per capita, the higher the risk of being downgraded by Moody's and the big three. And the more your ratings gets poorer, the higher the cost of capital. So again, that's a challenge that we need to continue to watch. And that is why in one of our recommendations, we are pushing very strongly for the reform of how risk ratings are done, because if we can't continue to discredit the poorer countries where the returns, the risk-adjusted margins for investments is proven to be much higher for the world and for all the investors themselves. But amidst that, we are seeing a more worrying challenge that concessional financing and access to grants that helps many African countries to be able to do development is dwindling. Despite the rebound in external financial flows we saw in 2023 because of portfolio flows that went from negative to positive, even in 2023, we already saw that FDI declined by 3.4%, ODA by 3%, and diaspora remittances by 6.2%. So, and recent announcements we are seeing from major ODA providing countries is projected to cost to take away about 4.2 billion in US dollars for aid for growth in development in Africa. So again, many people argue that the age of aid is over, the age of cheap money is over, and that is why the African Development Bank Group focused on this theme of making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. The time has come for the continent to look inwards and harness the rich assets that we have that has not been put to effective use. And on this particular slide, you can imagine we are paying more to access finance. We don't have enough in terms of fiscal capital. But if you look at fiscal financial flows out of the continent every year, we are losing more than 3 times the resources that Africa gets in terms of financial outflows. Here, just because of poor risk ratings that I've talked about, we'll lose about 74 billion US dollars. Illicit financial flows, the continent loses about 90 billion US dollars. Corruption costs the continent 148 billion US dollars. And the international profit shifting, base erosion and profit shifting is costing Africa about $275 billion US. When you sum only that up, we have $587 billion US leaving the shores of this continent every year. That is about 1.6 billion daily. But the continent had every form of international external flows into the continent. As at 2022, it was about around 190 billion. So if you do the math, Africa is actually a net creditor to the world. And it only takes better governance, rule of law, greater efficiency and accountability to hold these resources within the continent and channel it to better use. And the agency to do that lies within the continent. And then even for the resources that we borrow from loans and other things to do infrastructure, Africa has a 39% infrastructure financing gap, inefficiency gap, which simply means that we mobilize 100 billion for infrastructure in every year, 39 billion is done due to inefficiency. And actually, looking at the actual figures of infrastructure financing in Africa, our estimates is that finance inefficiency in financing infrastructure and project selection, project preparation, portfolio management, procurement, and other things costs Africa about $106 billion US every year. Again, the agency to hold this capital, to retain this capital on the continent and use it for development is within our reach. The IT people, this is not working very well. Can you please make sure it works? Then, if you look at all this, we can think about the potential downside risks that is within Africa's macroeconomic sphere. Persistent inflation is still ongoing, it's going down, the direction of travel is good, but we are not yet, it's not Uhuru yet. Now, we have high interest rate and the cost of capital, as I've talked about, debt servicing, debt refinancing remain a recurrent challenge for the continent. And then commodity dependence and price volatility in the commodity markets is another challenge that has continued to be a problem for the continent. And then needless to talk about the climate shocks and the recent trade tariffs and policy uncertainties that we are seeing. All these are headwinds that policymakers need to continue to keep in mind as we move forward. And then leads us to the second chapter of the report, which is on how we can boost domestic capital mobilization and efficient use in Africa. How can we be able to mobilize domestic resources in order to be able to do development more on the continent? And here we took a pause to define capital in a more broader term, in the real sense of it, that capital is not just money. Capital includes human capital. Africa has a lot of it. Natural capital. Africa has a lot of it. Fiscal capital, financial capital, but also business capital. But if you look on the right side of that, how you combine all these forms of capital together leads to how you produce goods and services to grow your economies and improve the quality of lives for citizens in countries. So bringing all this together is what we call inclusive growth. But the challenge is our focused quite a lot on finance. Great inefficiencies because of fiscal profligacy in Africa and how we use fiscal resources. Great inefficiencies in how we use natural capital because of high discount rates that forces countries to sell commodities instead of add value to it. Great inefficiencies in how we use our human capital because of poor governance and rule of law on the continent that costs the Japa syndrome, if I speak the Nigerian language. That just means migration. So we have lots of Africa's capital migrating annually to contribute to development elsewhere for reasons that we in Africa can control. And then if you go forward, just keep this combining different types of assets that we have on the continent in your mind as we go through the presentation. So why are we not able to combine that effectively? State capacity and external factors is what we found drives low domestic capital mobilization, retention, and efficient use on the continent. You look at it from every lens, you see that government revenue in Africa is comparing very poorly to all the other regions at 19.8% of GDP. But the point I need to make is that African countries use 80%, basically 80% of total public expenditure in Africa is from this 19.8%. And that is why the scale of development is not yet being able to break the vicious cycles of poverty. But Africa is not as dependent as we always used to think. Because only 20% of Africa's public finances is coming from the external sources. Find that we have a lot of headroom in our revenue mobilization on the continent. But to give an olive branch, the hope we find is that when you look at that right figure there, you'll find that there are countries in Africa who already understand how to do this and are even exceeding their peers in other regions. Countries like Lesotho, South Africa, Morocco, and many other countries are performing at par with regard to revenue mobilization. And we also see that when you invest in revenue mobilization in Africa, you see rapid results. And that is what we have seen in Cote d'Ivoire, in different countries where the African Development Bank Group has invested in terms of helping in the revenue mobilization on the continent. Several examples are there to show that it is possible. It's not rocket science. Then, second point here is that weak tax administration capacity in Africa is also leading to underperformance in tax collection on the continent. And you see on that right side of the graph, Africa is just about 14.8 as at 2023, 14.8% of GDP, compared to 32.9% in Europe and Central Asia. And even Africa itself has a tax capacity of about 20%. So we still have a lot of headroom to do better in collecting revenue without increasing tax rates on the continent. It's just about efficiency in administration of revenue collection. And you will see some recommendations on how to deal with that. On the right side is again to show that Africa is not one country, and several countries in Africa are doing very well with regard to tax collection as well, telling me that we have lessons, examples to learn from within the continent that to make it easy for us. So it, again, is not rocket science. Non-tax revenue collection in Africa is also the same. On average, we have about 5.3% of GDP in non-tax revenue collection in Africa, compared to a world average of about 7.1%. But if you look into the data, you will find that Europe and Central Asia is about 14.6%, and Africa is just at about 5%. Huge headroom to be able to do better. Again, on that graph on the left side, you find that some African countries provide case studies on how to do this better. What about business capital? Everybody talks about mobilizing the private sector. But again, I see a lot of private sector entrepreneurs and gurus in the sector in this room. But again, they will tell you, even though they are large on the continent, Africa's private sector in terms of scale still remains small. And if you look at the number of 1 billion plus companies in Africa, we have just about 345 compared to 1,500 in China. So we still have a long headroom in order to be able to deliver more in that area. But one other debilitating factor is that Africa still invests very little in research and development at 0.4% on average, compared to 2% and more in countries where they provide the ecosystem that allows for innovation and entrepreneurship to thrive. If you look on that right side there, You also see that we have huge informality on the continent. About 85% of businesses in Africa operate in the informal sector, most of it non-taxed. Why? There's reasons why informality is thriving on the continent because of the nature and type of private capital that is being mobilized on the continent. If we did well in bringing in this private sector, providing an ecosystem for SMEs to thrive on the continent, we can mobilize about $125 billion annually. These are much more than the resources that we focus a lot on to try and mobilize externally. There is money in Africa. It is about mobilizing and valorizing it. So in general, we find in our report that if we focused on simply improving the efficiency, quality of institutions, transparency and accountability, macroeconomic policy governance, and all the recommendations that we always continue to talk about on the continent, this continent can mobilize $1.43 trillion every year without increasing tax rate. These are just headrooms that we have in the existing policies and institutions that are avenues for mobilizing resources on the continent. And that is much more than we need to achieve the SDGs, which is 1.3 trillion. So if we go forward, when you get the report, you will see where each source of that 1.4 trillion is coming from. This is not rocket science. It's simply looking closer on what we have in order to use what we have to get what we want. And that led us, since we are finding out that institutions, quality, rule of law, transparency, accountability are the issues, is it just hearsay? Let's look at the correlations and the relationships on how quality of institutions, economic governance, and rule of law impacts on revenue mobilization in Africa, but also globally. If you look at the graph here, we'll find that the governance indicators, in terms of using Mo Ibrahim governance indicators in Africa, has been improving quite a lot, except in in issues around political instability and absence of violence. On all the other indicators, whether you look at the PEFA reports or the Mo Ibrahim reports, every report that is tracking the quality of institutions in the world, Africa has done well in the past 10 years, but we're not doing well enough when we compare ourselves with the rest of the world, which is the slide on the right side there. A lot of work needs to be done there. Why is this happening? So the key drivers and consequences of weak governance in Africa are huge. And if we understand where the rain starts beating us, then we can know when to get an umbrella. And this is why we looked at this, and we find that capacity constraints, capacity in mobilizing natural capital, in mobilizing domestic capital, fiscal capital, and all forms of capital is at the root of the inefficiencies we have in institutions. When we have them, you don't have the money, you cannot set the systems to build the right institutions, to mobilize more resources, but also make the resources that you mobilized more efficient. But corruption has almost equal, if not more, impact than lack of financing in terms of the nature and quality of our institutions. Corruption in public service delivery, corruption in the public sector, but also corruption in how external parties relate with Africa. But other issues there is political instability and political interference in governance systems. That's independence or non-independence of different units of government, high levels of informality we've talked about, historical legacies and part dependencies where we are not negotiating the right contracts because of history and historical legacies. Some call it colonial history. Then also weak leadership in terms of who simply is leading the organization or leading the country. And all these lead to state capture. And because of state capture, we have lack of public trust among citizens, so they don't pay taxes. We have low tax and non-tax revenue because of poor, weak administration capacity. And we have fiscal profligacy and poor public financial management. We have high risk perception and cost of capital not because of perception alone, but also because of real challenges in the governance and stability of economies, but we also have base erosion and profit shifting by international and corporate organizations, abuse of power and illicit financial flows, and corruption. You notice that corruption is on both sides because it drives weak institutions and it creates weak institutions. Now, if you try to go deeper in terms of efficiency in tax mobilization, you will find, again, please, can you put back this slide? So you will find that governance quality has very direct implication on efficiency of resource mobilization, whether it's domestic or external. So when we talk about dwindling aid, dwindling FDI, dwindling remittances and portfolio flows, governance quality of countries we see is very directly related with it. The better governance you create, the more capital flows to your country. Transparency, accountability, control of corruption, property rights, and rules-based governance also have very direct implications on domestic and foreign revenue mobilization, especially in tax and non-tax collection. And because of this, it is only simply because when you have all these qualities, you create market stability, political stability that allows countries to, investors to believe in you and invest in your countries. So governance quality and tax revenue are very highly correlated. So if you improve effectiveness and the quality of controlling corruption, you increase tax revenue. If you also, but one thing we find as countries that have natural resource rents will have an inverse relationship with tax revenue. So more natural resource and focus on natural resource rents is actually a challenge for many African countries. So put together, state capacity, state capture is at the root of poor mobilization and utilization of resources in Africa, because it creates the elites will now negotiate preferential laws and regulations, tax exemptions, privileges, and so on. This is what I call the neocolonialism effect. Then we have monopolistic and oligopolistic competition emerging that creates weak property rights and high political risks, and that crowds out SMEs, and they all go informal because they don't trust what is going on in the government. And then corruption, tax evasion, all these things is just a vicious cycle. And these are things that can be handled from within the continent. It's just a political will to try and do that. Please change the slide. This is not working. Can you be changing it from there? So we go to policy recommendations. Next, please. On policy recommendations, we find that for the short and medium term, macroeconomic policy management remains key. How do we coordinate fiscal and monetary policy in the continent? Fiscal prudence, governance, and institutional reforms remain key. And also preemptive debt restructuring and decoupling our mindsets from aid and debt from consumption to focus on debt productivity is a key aspect. But in the medium term, we need to deepen regional economic integration and trade. We also need to leverage the ACFTA. We already have the instrument. We need to implement local content and franchising policies to allow us to add more value to our resources, but also preferred procurement to create domestic demand in the continent, and also strategic partnership that can mobilize development finance from our partners. Next, please. And domestic revenue mobilization and retention remains a major issue we need to focus on, and different aspects. If you go back on tax revenue, we have a clear toolbox of what countries need to do in order to mobilize more tax revenue, but also leverage the resources within the continent. On efficiency in productivity for natural and human capital, there are several things that we need to do, but focusing on natural capital accounting and upgrading our systems of national accounts alone can hugely increase GDP growth on the continent. We already released a report on this. but also we need natural resource ownership. Quite a lot of times we talk about resource potentials on the continent, but who owns those resources? Have we signed them away to foreign firms? And, I don't need to go too much into that. But we need also to improve transparency and accountability in how we use our natural resources to become more accountable to citizens. On human capital, we need to scale up appropriate education, and our emphasis is on appropriate education that feeds into the needs of the businesses in those countries, the needs of government and productivity on the continent. But we need to focus a lot more on leveraging the diaspora. If I just spend 1 minute on this, Africa's diaspora rose from about 19 million in 1990 to 48 million in 2024. I have seen that consistently remittances is the most steady and counter-cyclical source of resources for many African countries, estimated to rise to 283 billion by 2030. And if we have clear and well-crafted policies, it can immediately rise to 500 billion today. So how we relate with our diasporans is very critical in terms of how we are going to be able to move this forward. We need to deepen integration and strengthen financial institutions on the continent. On regional integration and economic integration, I won't talk so much about it because we have discussed that in last year. But we have the ACFTA, we have several instruments that we need to continue to leverage more and more in order to deepen integration on the continent. But we can't have integration when Africans can't move from one country to the other. We can't have integration when the cost of travel between the continent, you would prefer to go to London or go to the US. So we need to continue to invest in the high five sectors, in transport and regional corridors and so on and so forth. You get the report, you will see the details on key growth drivers in regional integration we need to invest in. But we also need to strengthen Africa's development finance institutions. You have already seen, if you're borrowing from the African Development Bank Group, you pay 500% less than if you are borrowing from the capital market. So it's not rocket science. A bigger African Development Bank Group, a bigger African Development Fund, a bigger Africa 50, and many of our African institutions will deliver more development to the continent. But we also need to establish the missing ones, like the Africa Financial Stability Mechanism or the Africa Monetary Institute, to help support the continent on debt refinancing, but also on price stability across the continent. Because when you look into the countries of the continent, a lot of these are already happening in some countries. It's just for us to learn from each other and scale it up. And that can happen. So next slide. And here is my final slide on what actually is like what the president calls changing the Intel inside, the software that drives all these things we are talking about. And that software change needs to happen in Africa, African leaders and African citizens, but also in African development partners. For African leaders and African citizens, we need to strengthen African unity. True African unity, where an African and factors of production can flow freely from one country to the other. We need to make sure that we have a stronger African Union that is able to bring political stability and one voice for Africa on global issues. We need to implement the ACFTA. We need also to drive Africa's sovereignty in natural resources, in economic sovereignty and other things. But above all, we also need to create demand for Africa's products by Africans in Africa. We can't expect SMEs to grow if our taste is to buy, what do they call it? Toothpick from China. If you don't buy African products, there is no way. It's not rocket science. African entrepreneurs will not thrive. But for the development partners, we need, again, the reform in mindset. That reform in mindset, changing the Intel Insights, is about the global financial architecture. We dwelt on it last year. The global financial architecture we have today does not deliver capital to where capital is needed most by African and developing countries, but also by investors in the developed countries. If resources are not going to where you have greater risk-adjusted rates of return, what kind of economics are we doing? Yeah. So for both developed and developing countries, reforming the global financial architecture is very necessary. On risk perception, on global taxation that allows that 275 billion to leave the shores of poor countries in Africa. We need climate finance that is simplified enough to ensure that climate financing flows to climate vulnerable countries. Please read our AU. We can't achieve our global climate goals if we continue that way. Base erosion and profit shifting needs to stop, but we also need to continue to provide concessional financing because we see that only that can actually drive development for a longer term. I hear a lot of conversation of private sector coming to the rescue. Private sector does not come to do development. I'm sorry. Private sector comes for profit. And when private sector comes for profit, interest rates will continue to go higher and African countries will remain locked in a debt conundrum. So we can't replace public resources with private resources in development. Both are important, but public resources should be used to leverage private sector more using de-risking instruments and several innovations that the African Development Bank and others have been leading. But we also need to move from an extractives for export agenda to a win-win agenda that delivers growth in countries that are natural resources rich, high profits to investors that come to invest in those resources, but also reduces the global carbon footprint of trade. What we have now of mining resources from Congo and taking it to China or US or anywhere else to produce is 3 times more in terms of the cost of production. But it also has huge carbon footprint in those products that we are going to produce and then send back to sell to Congo and many African countries. So achieving inclusive growth that drives global sustainability, reduces climate change, but delivers on what we all care about, poverty reduction, jobs for youths and women, and other things is possible, but we need to change the intel inside. We need to work together to have a good handshake of equal and productive partnership with the continent. I don't believe that aid leads to growth, but I don't believe that aid is not necessary for growth. It is, but it is how it is delivered and how it is utilized. So we need to work on cost of capital. This is central because the cost of even climate finance is crowding out fiscal sustainability on the continent. Countries borrow to do climate adaptation, and the cost of refinancing those debts crowds out investments in health, investments in education, investment in resilient infrastructure, and so on. We need to collectively work together to change the intel inside. Transparency and accountability is a buzzword in all these discussions on debt. I sit in many discussions. It's about debtor transparency. What about creditor transparency? We need transparency on both sides if we are actually going to be able to drive better efficiency in how we move resources forward. Like base erosion and profit shifting, that is the largest leakage of resources on the continent. It can't happen from one side. We need cross-border capital flows that is more affordable, cheaper, and more transparent on both sides as well. But we also need global peace and security. We cannot continue fighting wars and expect development to happen. There cannot be development without peace. And when you look at African countries that have high resources and are not delivering on development, there is one form of conflict or other going on in those countries. Why is that the case? We need to continue to work together to make this happen, and it is possible. Let's work together to make Africa's capital work for Africa's development. It is good for Africa, and it is good for investors that invest in Africa. Thank you very much.